drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. Thank you for joining me.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Do you want to just start off by telling everyone a little bit about who you are and what you study?
Sure. Yeah, my name is William Parker. I worked at Duke for 27 years, 11 months before retiring from there, and then I'm still a scientist, still working in science. I'm also a blacksmith. I've been married for 36 years, just celebrated our anniversary, so somebody keeps me straight, keeps me out of trouble. I started out with a PhD in chemistry, but in biochemistry and biophysics specifically, and that really evolved over years, and I got a job doing biochemistry of immunology, and then we've been doing a lot more immunology, a lot more asking the question why do people get sick, that kind of thing, and why do people get appendicitis, and that there are a lot of interesting questions that I know that you talk about a lot on your show. So it's super happy to be here, and I think we'll have a fun time.
Yeah, let's we're going to talk about the appendix quite a bit, and let's just start out with some basic gut anatomy to help us start to think about where it is, what it might be doing, if anything. As I'm sure many people grew up, as a child, I was always told that this appendix we have is a vestigial organ. I've known people, we've all probably known some number of people that had appendicitis, their appendix burst. Sometimes people even die from this. It's not uncommon for people to have their appendix removed. And the story I grew up with, and that many of us did, is that, again, it's a vestigial organ. It doesn't do anything. But let's just start with some basic gut anatomy. As we exit the stomach and get into the GI tract, what are some of the major parts there, and where exactly does the appendix fit in anatomically?
Well, so of course, when you exit the stomach, you go into the small intestine, and then the small intestine, we've got different parts of the small intestine that differ a lot, just by looking at them. If you were a surgeon looking at them, you might not really be able to tell too much difference, but you've got different biochemical sort of processes going on, and in the upper small intestine versus the lower small intestine. And then you get to a big junction where everything changes, really looks differently, and that's called the ileocecal valve, right? So you go from the jejunum to ileum, and then, which all sort of looks the same if you're a surgeon looking at it, but then you get into this you go from a small tube to a big tube, and you go from not many bacteria to a lot of bacteria in something called the cecum. And of course, in humans, we have a smaller cecum than in what we call hindgut fermenters, right, which have a bigger cecum. And then a lot of times, it's almost exactly shaped like your little finger. Sprouting off of that cecum in humans is it's called vermiform or worm-like appendix. And then that's kind of off to the side, and then the cecum leads into in humans, it's the ascending transverse descending colon, then sigmoid colon. And each one of those sort of looks different, and we did a lot of work in the early days, it's the early 2000s, just looking at how the bacteria interact with different parts of the colon differently. But in terms of what's going on with your food, right, everything is pretty liquidy in the cecum and even in the ascending colon. But then when you get over into the transverse colon, then you're starting to get what we call bolus formation, which is, the fecal material is firming up, the water is being absorbed out. And then in the descending colon, then the fecal material is really formed up, and then the sigmoid colon and rectum and anus that's where you exit the system. That's if you're a piece of food, that's
Mhm.
That's your final goal there into our modern sewer systems.
Yeah. So after the stomach, you've got the small intestine. It's small in diameter compared to the large intestine, which comes later. The small intestine pretty much looks anatomically similar from one end to the other. You'd have to be a trained expert to really see the differences there. But there are biochemical differences. The what's going on at the chemical level is different at the beginning versus the end of the small intestine. And then you said there's this structure called the cecum, and that's
Cecum.
with
Cecum.
the
C,
cecum.
yeah, cecum, yeah.
Would that be the end of the small intestine, or is that a different thing in between the small and the
So
large
that's
intestine?
sort of the cecum is a pouch that begins the large bowel. So you could cut you. So a lot of our biology is duplication, right? Our
Yeah.
arms are duplicates of our legs and things. So your GI tract, you start out with a big pouch, the stomach, and then you go to a big chunk of the bowel, and then you've got another big pouch, which is called the cecum, and then you've got the rest of the bowel. And right, the small bowel is actually much longer than the large bowel, but in terms of diameter, the
Mhm.
large bowel is
Mhm.
bigger.
And so the cecum is the place where you start getting a greater density of microbes. There are microbes in the small intestine, but not as many as the later parts of the GI tract. And the
Right,
cecum,
right.
the appendix is sort of, like, as the name suggests, it's an appendage. It's an it's appendicized onto the cecum, so it's sort of just jutting off to the side.
Right, that is correct, yeah.
And so, okay, so it's roughly looks and is about the size of the pinky finger.
That is, well, I mean, it doesn't, I mean, it's roughly the same size and shape
Hmm.
as a pinky finger, but it doesn't look like a pinky finger. But yeah,
Hmm.
it looks like sort of the rest of the GI tract in terms of overall appearance.
Okay,
It
so
might it might be a little wider, especially at the tip, because it's got a lot of immune tissue with it.
yeah, yeah. So what? Yeah, when we start looking at the anatomy and the cell and like the cell anatomy, what does the structure look like? What's inside of it? What do we know about it?
Of the appendix in particular, or the
Yeah,
GI tract?
no, the appendix. Yeah.
Yeah, so the appendix, you see a lot of, what we call villi, which, and this can be confusing. They're finger-like projections, but they don't actually look physically the
Hmm.
size of a finger. They're tiny little villi, and then if you look at an even smaller level, there's microvilli on top of the villi, but it gives you a lot of surface area. But in the appendix, the really big thing that you see, there's two really big things you see, and one is lots of immune tissue. So there's a concentration of immune tissue right there at the tip of the appendix. And in animals that don't have an appendix, that just have a cecum with no appendix, you will see a lot of immune tissue at the apex of the cecum.
Hmm.
So the appendix is sort of a specialized version of that immunological part of the cecum. And then that's one thing you'll see is a lot of immune tissue. And secondly, you see what we call bacterial biofilms. And I think you guys have talked about those a lot on your show, but you get a living film of bacteria. It goes really nicely in there. It's the best formed in the appendix. It's pretty good in the cecum in general. And in the ascending colon, it kind of breaks down a little bit based on studies that we've done looking at non-human primates.
Hmm. So there's a concentration of immune tissue there. That just brings up right away for me the idea of appendicitis. Apparently, a lot of people have an inflamed appendix. That's why it needs to be removed. It can explode. I would imagine that because it's got a high concentration of immune tissue, that's why it's prone to inflammation. So, what is appendicitis, and what does it have to do with the structure there?
Right. So appendicitis, of course, it just is a general term that means inflammation of the appendix.
Hmm.
Tonsillitis, inflammation of the tonsils. So it's a very general term, and so the weird thing about appendicitis is it doesn't actually generally explode, but what happens is it can be inflamed enough to become leaky, and that's essentially, for practical intents and purposes, it's an explosion because you're going to leak out. Everything is going to get what we call septic. Basically,
Mm.
your whole abdominal cavity will then become infected, and in about when that kind of thing happens, the death rate of untreated appendicitis is about 50%.
Hmm. So basically,
Yeah,
the appendix becomes inflamed, it starts leaking, and then you've got nasty stuff that leads to a body-wide infection.
yeah, pretty much. I mean, yeah, and that with 50% death rate. So when we, one of the really fun things that we discovered was, Randy Bollinger and I, and every day he was taking out appendices. And I was the immunologist working in the lab, right? And one day he just said, hey, because we already knew that the immune system was supporting bacteria. He said, "Hey, I bet I know what causes," or he said, "I know what the appendix is for." And immediately I knew. He didn't have to say it because it was so obvious when somebody said it. But the bottom line is, yeah, we know what it does. And there's some really beautiful data coming out of Europe that tells us, yeah, this is what it does. But we don't, the main thing when I talk about the appendix is, please, just because we know what your appendix does, if you get appendicitis, go see your doctor. If they need to take it out, go let them take it out. We know why it gets inflamed. Totally separate set of issues, which you're asking me about now. But go ahead and get it taken out if it gets inflamed so you don't die. That would be, really, really unfortunate for our work to lead to somebody's death because they didn't want to get their appendix taken out. Mm-hmm. So back to your question, why does it get inflamed, right? So a guy named David Barker in 1988, he's an epidemiologist in Britain, and he came up with the term hygiene hypothesis, that we're so clean that our immune system becomes overreactive. And it's sort of, you pointed it out, right? There's a lot of immune tissue there. Well, there's a lot of immune tissue throughout the gut, so you can get, inflammatory bowel disease as well, different types as well. But the appendix is one of those areas where, and basically
and it's an internal body surface. So, you would imagine that there has to be a lot of immune system surveillance there because this is the interface between us and, the rest of the world.
Yep, absolutely. It's sort of like our skin, except it's more bacteria laden than our skin. I mean, our skin has a lot of bacteria, but it's sort of limited in diversity compared to the gut.
Okay, so there's a lot of bacteria down there. There's a lot of immune system concentrated at the appendix. And okay, so what is it doing?
Well, so the big breakthrough that we had, it was that I figured out, it was an epiphany. We were working on a field called xenotransplantation, a cross-species transplantation. And we figured out, okay, these bacteria don't seem to be trying to escape or avoid the immune system. Like pathogens will tend to try to mimic human biology. They'll tend to not express things what the human immune system easily recognizes. Whereas our gut bacteria, they were expressing the same thing generation after generation, so much so that what we call natural antibodies that we all have. So and blood group antibodies is classical. If you're blood group A, you'll have blood group B antibodies. And if you're blood group O, you'll have A and B antibodies. And there's other antibodies that even blood group A, B people have that are in a related class. And that's what we were studying because we were interested in antibodies that cross-react between species. So bottom line is these bacteria were not trying to avoid the immune system at all. They were, in fact, expressing these molecules even more. So what we figured out was that the immune system was supporting the bacteria. The bacteria were expressing receptors, and other people did some beautiful work showing that your immune system is feeding. We didn't really look at the feeding part. We looked at more molecular recognition part. They're feeding those bacteria, cultivating those bacteria inside the gut. Really a beautiful, elegant, symbiotic system, very mutualistic.
So those bacteria they're not behaving like pathogens. They're not trying to camouflage or hide or get away in order to avoid detection by the immune system. They are behaving as if they should be there.
Precisely. Yeah, precisely. It's like they're, the microbiota is an organ system, right? So it's, it makes sense that everything is working together in a cohesive fashion. So yeah, that's really what the immune system is doing right there, is it's interacting with those bacteria. In its interactions with those bacteria, it learns a lot about what kinds of things are dangerous, what kind of things are not dangerous. It's a training, part of the training of the immune system.
So can you talk a little bit about, so when you have bacteria like this that are not pathogenic, that are supposed to be there, contained within this niche of the gut, how is the immune system feeding them, and how is it detecting and interacting with them so that it's keeping them at bay but not killing them or trying to destroy them like it would a pathogen?
Yeah, so in a way it kind of keeps them at bay, but and the way it does it is by it helps them form these things called biofilms. So the feeding process is more or less through mucus. So they digest mucus, we feed them mucus, and there were some really elegant studies in mice that only have one bacteria. You can show if the bacteria can't eat the mucus, then the body, and these are mice, they'll stop producing the mucus that can't be digested by the bacteria, and they'll produce other mucus that can be digested by the bacteria. So mucus is really a good way to feed your bacteria, a nice carbohydrate meal. Of course, we're supposed to be feeding them fiber, and we do a poor job of that in Western society, but so they have a really protected space. But the molecular recognition part that we were working on is also really elegant. We put out these molecules, which in antibodies primarily, immunoglobulin A primarily, and it helps them form a matrix. So that normally bacteria on their own have to form their own matrix to sort of glom together, form a film, and the films stick much better than a single bacteria. So that's what bacteria do. They grow, it's called the sessile state versus the planktonic state. So that help in a flowing system. If you look at, say, a sewer pipe, there will be a bacterial lining on those pipes, but the bacteria have to make all their own molecules, whereas we help them by helping them make their matrix.
I see. So these biofilms, they're like little platforms that enable the bacteria to hang out and stay in one spot, despite the fact that they're constantly being, they're adjacent to this flowing tube of stuff.
Right. Yes. And these are really dynamic biofilms. I mean, they shed off and regrow constantly. And if you look at the fecal material, right place, right time, you can see beautiful sections of biofilms. There was a paper published just looking at biofilms that are on food material that's coming out in the fecal stream. So it's a really very, very elegant system. And if our immune system helps these bacteria form the biofilm, it gives those bacteria a huge advantage over some other bacteria coming in that's trying to make its own biofilm and do its own thing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So the immune system can selectively help certain bacteria form a biofilm to keep them there and thereby keep out other bacteria that might otherwise try and make their own biofilm and displace them.
Yeah, basically if you're another bacteria and you want to make your own biofilm, you almost have no chance, right? Because you've got to produce all these molecules all by yourself. So you may as well just go along with the host, use the host resources. But in doing so, you basically make a compromise as a bacteria, right? As you're going to produce these molecules so that you can be recognized by the immune system. But then if you accidentally get out into the periphery in the bloodstream, boom, that's it. You're gone. You're picked up because you're carrying these tags with you. So it's, again, a really elegant system to maintain a microbiota that's advantageous to the microbiota, because then the microbiota doesn't kill the host. And at the same time, it's advantageous to the host to keep the microbiota where it is, so it doesn't get killed. Yeah.
And it's pretty intuitive at this point, especially for people who've listened to this podcast. We've talked about the microbiome in different contexts before. There's a microbiome. There's some bacteria that are supposed to be there. We want them there and not other bacteria that can make us sick. It makes sense that different parts of the gut will have different bacteria that we want to be there. We're talking about the appendix. There's some bacteria that are really good at hanging out there. You mentioned the hygiene hypothesis, and I want you to start connecting the dots here for us. I would imagine that, over time, as we've become more hygienic and we've invented more antibiotics and we've changed the types of foods and things that are going through our gut and everything in our environment, that has probably changed which bacteria can easily grow in this region of the gut, in and near the appendix. And that itself has probably obscured our ability to discern what that organ is actually for.
Yeah, so let's dive into that one. That's a really fun topic. So first of all, let me say that while this is really fun and obvious to the people listening to this, when we first figured out, it was about 2004, we first figured out that the immune system is supporting these bacteria, we just got ridiculed. And that was, everybody knew your immune system was in a constant battle with your gut bacteria because the field of immunology came from the field of infectious disease. So, when we figured it out, we're just it's exactly the same thing you're saying. Wow, this is so obvious. It makes so much sense from an evolutionary perspective, but it did not get received well.
So at the time, it was considered preposterous by immunologists that the immune system would be helping some bacteria instead of constantly just trying to destroy them.
Absolutely. It was considered preposterous. Yes, that's right. I remember we got a review on one paper. It just said, this investigator appears to never have heard of mucus. So, and of course, what the reviewer, and of course, these are renowned professors who get to review these papers, and the investigator was thinking, well, everybody knows mucus is there as a barrier. right? And this was just at the time when the data were coming out showing that we're actually feeding our bacteria mucus. So it's 2004. The paradigm hasn't shifted yet.
Right.
So it's a tough battle. So, right. So back to the question of what's gone wrong with the modern immune system. So it was David Barker in 1988. I talked to him. He's passed away now, and I talked to him back when he was actively working on this, and he said he thought it was hot water heaters and that were causing appendicitis. And that just sounds flaky. But if you think historically and you go back, okay, soap was something you got, especially old soap that didn't have the kinds of emulsifiers that our soap does today. That soap, you needed hot water, or it's an irritant. It just sticks. You have to use hot water to get it on and off efficiently. And back in the day, hot water was not a utility. It was a commodity, right? You had to carry the water. You had to cut the wood. You had to build a fire. You had to do a lot of work to get hot water, so you just didn't stick your dirty hands in it. It didn't make any sense. So he said, when in talking to him, he said, look, when you switch that, then you allow everybody to use soap after they go to the bathroom. You prevent transmission. You don't prevent transmission of bacteria. Super important, but you do prevent transmission of some other organisms. The soil-transmitted helminths is Helminths. So you're basically looking at intestinal worms, protozoa, things of that nature that we generally, unfortunately, have classified all as parasites. But those drop off. And I'm talking about David Barker because he's the one that really connected this with the appendix. But it was 1968 when this was really all figured out by a guy named Brian Greenwood. And then 1970, Peter John Preston was looking at the loss of these certain organisms and why people in Africa weren't having problems with autoimmune and allergic disease.
So it seems like what you're getting at here is that when we started using soaps of different kinds, those soaps disproportionately removed essentially larger organisms larger than bacteria, like protozoans, so single-celled eukaryotic cells, like these little tiny worms that are tiny to our eyes, but still much bigger than microbes, than single-celled bacteria and things like that. We've started removing some of those. And I think what you're implying here is that similar to the gut microbiome that we normally think of as being beneficial or at least neutral bacteria, there are also other organisms, including little tiny worms, that are supposed to be in our guts, basically.
Yeah, they're supposed to be. And some of them aren't so little tiny, right? And some of them can be very painful. So it's sort of like a bacteria, right? The difference between a salmonella and a lactobacillus is pretty big in terms of, but they're both bacteria. So the same is true with worms. There are some worms nobody's ever heard of, but if you take care of animals on a farm, you're probably exposed to them a lot versus, if you live in a city. It was in the late 1800s when allergies first started showing up on the radar screen, and they thought there were a lot of ideas about what was causing hay fever, and they thought maybe education did it. And by the way, that's not true. That's not true. But they were trying to figure it out back then. You're looking at 150 years ago, trying to sort this stuff out, and they just didn't. Of course, at that time, they didn't understand that our immune system gets trained by its environment. So if you take away a whole swath and it's not just soap for us, it's living in houses that are clean, not being in contact with the soil. Everybody uses a toilet. So we have sewer treatment facilities. We don't walk around barefoot. And for a lot of these things get transmitted through intermediate hosts. So if we don't eat a lot of insects by accident, if insects and rodents can't get into our food supply, then we interrupt the chain a lot.
Right. So it's like a double-edged sword, hygiene and the modern environment we've created over time. On the one hand, we're less exposed to many infectious diseases that used to kill people and babies and stuff all the time. But on the other hand, we're also not exposed to the possibly beneficial or the neutral or the only mildly irritating bugs that are out there that are actually importantly involved in that training of the immune system early in life.
Yeah, it's sort of between. I think we wrote one paper about being between a hygienic hard place and a rock or something. Some that kind of analogy where you don't want cholera, memic dysentery, and typhoid, but if you don't have these organisms, then the rates of allergy, autoimmunity, and neuropsychiatric stuff. That's one of the big things we found while I was at Duke. Those kind of things will tend to go up and up and up.
Yeah, it's a trade-off. So people started getting, when did people first start getting appendicitis more? Was there a clear time that was happening?
Yeah, that was in the late 1800s. Yeah,
Yeah.
and fortunately, at the same time people were getting appendicitis, we also got surgeons.
Hmm.
So it
Hmm.
worked out, but
Yeah.
that was basically when people started moving into cities
Right.
with sewage
Right.
systems.
So roughly speaking, people started getting appendicitis around the time we started getting like other allergies and things like that.
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah,
it's correlated
inflammatory
with
bowel.
the development of what we call modern society, and so people started getting appendicitis, and it has something to do with the immune system overreacting. What happens? So when you take, a lot of people have had their appendix removed over the last several decades. Is is there anything that happens after people get their appendix removed where we can see like they have a problem with something like digestion or anything that hints at what that appendix was doing for them?
Right. So based on the biology of the system, we can tell that it's essentially a safe. The appendix itself is a safe house for beneficial bacteria, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's out of the way. If you get, say, cholera or something, and it flushes out the main system, the appendix can be used as a reboot mechanism. But in modern society, we don't have a lot of those kinds of infectious diseases. And what we do have, though, is a lot of antibiotics, and most antibiotics, but not all, most of those will. And it was somebody who was interviewing me. He said, "It sounds like you're deleting your backup drive," and that's a pretty good
Hmm.
analogy.
Hmm.
Is that you've got this backup supply of bacteria inside your appendix, and of course, in modern times, sometimes our bacteria can sort of go bad. You start reacting to your own bacteria, and your bacteria themselves, your microbiota begins to have some problems, and we can talk about that if you want. I know you've had other guests talking about that, but the bottom line is if you were if you could somehow go to a hunter-gatherer society, you would be, if you were missing your appendix, you would have a lot more problems recovering from an infection
Right.
because your backup drive isn't there. Now, of course, in modern times, they're going to give you antibiotics, which are broad
Right.
spectrum.
Right.
They're going to delete the bacteria in your appendix anyway, so it really doesn't. One clinician said, "Well, this is all just theoretical." Like, well, it's biology that we kind of circumvent with modern
Right,
medicine.
right. It's like, yeah, the backup drive being gone is only going to be a problem if you actually really need the backup drive. But if you've got ways to get around that loss, then it would appear, as it did appear to so many people, that this thing wasn't doing anything at all.
Right, and maybe in modern society it really doesn't do much, right? Because
Mhm.
we don't get cholera and
Right.
typhoid, maybe dysentery. And the best study has been done, a European study. Michel Lauren, who I know, did a great job, just looking at non-human primates, and it gives them a huge advantage in terms of survival from diarrhea. They just don't get, if they have an appendix, they get a lot less. They get a less prevalence of severe diarrhea. They still get diarrhea, but it's just not as severe as
Mhm.
animals without an appendix get.
Yeah. So basically, the idea here is if you've got something like severe diarrhea or an infection like cholera, something that's basically going to flush out your whole GI tract, you want something. To the extent that happens, an animal is going to want something that quickly repopulates their gut microbiome the way they want it, this backup drive, so to speak. The appendix might be serving that function. Do we have any hard data on, when people get, or other species, when they get diseases that result in severe diarrhea, that it is in fact doing that? It's repopulating the gut. Are they more prone to gut issues after having certain GI problems if they're missing the appendix?
Yeah, so that's what Michelle's data showed, is that if you have an appendix, you just recover from diarrhea much faster, and it doesn't
Hmm.
become severe and protracted.
Mhm.
That's the bottom line. And there's some other. We know that the original idea by Charles Darwin, it was Charles Darwin who first said it was a vestigial organ. And if he had known what we know, he would never have said that. I mean, we know that, and again, this is Michel Lawrence work. Some of it earlier work he did with us. It's just it has appeared much more frequently in phylogeny than it's been lost.
Hmm.
So
Okay,
that
yeah, I wanted
tells
to
you
ask
that.
you about that. Yeah, which in the tree of life, like where do we see the appendix? What types of animals have it?
Well, so it generally is present in course, humans, apes, old world monkeys. It's present in some lemurs, which are a different branch. It's present in some rodents. It's present in monotremes. You see a type of appendix in some fish and some birds. So it's around here and there. And like I said, when Michelle is an evolutionary biologist, which I am not, and but when they do their analysis, I think they can show how many times it's appeared here and there all over the place.
So when you look at the tree of life and you see something that's scattered like this, some species have it, some don't. There's kind of two broad possibilities. One, maybe all animals used to have it and then a bunch of them lost it because it is becoming vestigial, say, or maybe multiple branches independently evolved it. Like we know the eyes independently evolved in different branches, like us versus say octopuses and things like that, which implies that there's a similar adaptive value being evolved in different parts of the tree of life. It sounds like what you're saying is we think that this was a convergent evolution thing where multiple branches evolved it in different, independently of one another.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and that's what those guys do for a living. They use, probability analysis and try to determine did it happen a single time and it keeps getting lost, or is it popping up independently here and there? And the conclusion is it's popping up independently.
And that would imply that different animals in different places have a similar evolutionary challenge that's being met by this organ. And is there anything that they share in common in terms of lifestyle, diet, or anything like that?
We tried so hard to figure out what was going on there. And of course, well, I'm going to say, of course, a lot of people are familiar with the human scenario where Darwin thought as we switch from a more plant-based diet to a more fruit and meat-based diet that our cecum shrinks because you don't need a big fermentation chamber in the hindgut. And then as your cecum shrinks, you can get an appendix that sort of gets left behind. And it turns out that is what happened in humans, but it's not typical, right? A lot of times the appendix will appear as the cecum's getting bigger. It just depends on which part of the tree of life that you're looking at. So we tried really hard to find something. The one thing you can find is that animals with an appendix tend to live longer, and there's a huge correlation there. So it's probably that in animals that live longer have to spend more energy on immune function, which is a trade-off with other stuff. So, and that the appendix would be one of those things that you would spend more effort on because you're maintaining your microbiome.
What about modern humans today who have their appendix removed? Are they more sensitive to certain things in the diet? Are they more prone to certain gut issues?
Yeah, so the answer is yes and no. I mean, so for example, if you keep in mind a modern human is not, their immune system is not okay.
Right.
All right. We'll start out with that. I mean, 40% of us have allergies, 10% autoimmune disease, 20% neuropsychiatric problems that are related to inflammation affecting the brain, and so on and so on and so on. So you're not looking at an organism within its natural environment. You're looking at what used to be called an evolutionary trap or an evolutionary mismatch or an environmental mismatch, all of those kinds of things. So the answer is taking out an appendix has some pluses and it has some minuses. It can really help decrease the prevalence of ulcerative colitis, for example, which is something we shouldn't have anyway, right? And it's immunosuppressive, essentially, because you're taking out a chunk of immune tissue. You can really see the effect in rabbits because their appendix is huge. But in humans, it's mildly immunosuppressive, so you get lowered. It's just like an immunosuppressive drug. You get lowered inflammatory problems, also, and you get slightly increased risk of certain kinds of cancers and infections. So, again, yeah, there's no clinical evidence that says you shouldn't get it taken out because you don't want that 50% chance of death.
Right, right. So yeah, there's maybe some slight issues that can come from it today, but those issues probably would have been bigger 150, 250 years ago when we were having more severe diarrhea, cholera, and things like that.
Yeah. So people ask me, we figured this thing out with the appendix. That was back in 2007, right? So people ask me, well, why not do the incisive experiment? I say, look, well, we've got really good data from non-human primates, but to do the incisive experiment, I mean, excuse me, it would just be unethical, right? You have to go find a hunter-gatherer population that doesn't have modern toilets, and then you have to do a sham operation on a bunch of them and randomly assign them to taking out their appendix or not, and then follow them long term. And you probably, I mean, some laboratory mice and rats are really interesting because they are, in those species, the appendix is variable. But even then, you probably wouldn't want to do that experiment. I mean, you have to expose them to a bunch of natural infections with or without a sham operation. I guess you can't do it in rabbits because it changes their immune system so much. The appendix is so big. Anyway, it's just a tricky thing to think about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so talk a little bit more about, I feel like when we talk about the gut microbiome, everyone's usually talking about bacteria. Talk about some of these other organisms that, for most of human history, for most animals out in the wild, are a natural part of the gut. So you mentioned some of these worms and these protozoans. What are some of the major components of the natural biome that were around before the modern era for us?
Right. So we began about 1850 or so. We started depleting these larger organisms. So just by being born, you'll probably do a good job of getting your mother's bacteria. Even if they do a C-section, within a few weeks you'll have it. So it's not the bacteria that we're talking about. We're talking about different kinds, especially different kinds of helminths, Helminths, and especially we're interested in the ones that live in the intestine. Mm-hmm. Those we would have picked up, say, if we would have accidentally eaten an insect.
Yeah. Then you're a little kid, you're digging around in the dirt, putting stuff in your mouth.
Yeah, or a snail, or a piece of freshwater fish, or something like that, which is not recommended. You don't want to go out and try to get these things naturally. Mm-hmm. You can get some extremely nasty parasites, but if you look in, there's the largest randomized controlled trial in human history is done in rural China. Human history so far is done in rural China with deworming people, and they just can't see any difference. But moderate amounts of intestinal worms don't seem to have any deleterious effects at all. And we know from studies in the early 1970s, even 1968, that if you completely lose these things, then basically your immune system is not getting trained the way it should. Don't get me wrong, the microbiota do most of the training. Mm-hmm. Right? If you take away the microbiota, you almost have no immune system, and we do that in germ-free animals in the lab. So you mostly have your immune system, but it's just a little bit wacky. It's sort of like you built a car, but you didn't try to quite tune it right. It's got too much inflammation and not enough intelligence is what it's got, basically.
So the more depleted your biome is across the board, the less discerning or discriminating that the immune system tends to be.
Yeah, it goes back to something you said earlier. There's convergent evolution, for example, with the eye. So we know that flatworms and roundworms, cestodes and nematodes, they've sort of converged to learn how to live in the gut, and they kind of do the same things to our guts, even though they're they're just as different as bats and birds. Mm-hmm. Well, they're even way more different than that. So they're really different phylogenetically. So those two kinds of worms do similar things to modulate our immune system, and they do a lot of fine-tuning that we really have found that we need, because without that fine-tuning, you have this laundry list of basically, let's call it paranoid immune system problems, where you're reacting to harmless things in the environment, or you're reacting to harmless things in your own body, creating allergies and autoimmune disease. And of course, you can start having bad reactions to your own bacteria, creating inflammatory diseases of the gut. Mm-hmm.
So, before, I don't know, before roughly the 19th century, people just really not have food allergies and pollen allergies and stuff like that?
Yeah, as far as we can tell, that is correct.
Yeah, so that is really a new thing, and it seems very much to be tied with this hygiene hypothesis, as it's called.
So the hygiene hypothesis, that's sort of where immunologists got in the picture, and there's looking back historically and with hindsight, you can say, well, that may not have been the guys in 1970 were not immunologists, but I talked to Brian Greenwood. He's the one that figured this out in 1968. He boots on the ground in Africa. He was a brand new doctor, and he said he was looking, do they really have rheumatoid arthritis? Do they have these diseases that we have in the UK? And the answer was he found out no. And they sort of intuitively knew the big difference was these things that they were labeling as parasites, which are not all parasites, but that's how they had them labeled. So that was sort of intuitively obvious. That was in 1970, but then 20 years later, everything sort of took a step. They basically forgot what had been learned, and they came up with a hygiene hypothesis, even though so going from a conclusion in 1970, and they back translated this quickly into rodents and showed, yep, it works. It works. You can cure. There's a model of lupus that in Duke they work with to this day, and it was shown you can resolve that problem by putting in an intestinal worm. And they didn't use intestinal worms; they were using a malaria-like organism. But the bottom line was, you use these larger symbionts and you can resolve the problem. But by 1989, when David Strachan, who actually gets credit for the hygiene hypothesis, came out with a more modern version of that, they had already moved from this is our conclusion, this is what's doing it, to it's a step backwards to a hypothesis, which is an educated guess, right? Mm-hmm. So you move from a conclusion, we got it, we nailed it, to a hypothesis, and it was probably until 2004 or 5 before really we got back on track saying, okay, it's not these chronic infections, these viruses that we're passing around that have become more prevalent in modern society. It's these ancient symbiotes that we've lost because of toilets and clean drinking water, and because we wear shoes, and because we have refrigerators that keep rats out, and so on and so forth. That's really the problem. So it's historically, it's a really interesting how they had it figured out, and then they sort of lost it and came up with a hygiene hypothesis, and then eventually they got back to where they were in 1970.
So there's examples where you can treat a condition by giving someone what we think of as a bug.
Well, you got to be careful. The microbiologists hate it when you refer to bacteria as a bug. So
right.
But a lot of people do, which is, I just have learned not to do it because I'll get bit. So
but what did you say about lupus? You can treat lupus by giving someone.
Right. So it's in laboratory animals, and there's people that do. So we call it biohacking. I don't know if you guys do anything with that or not, but there's a lot of people out there that are basically have read the literature, and they go out and get a worm to treat their lupus or their relapsing remitting MS or their severe allergies or whatever.
So we're talking about people who get worms on purpose, and this can treat autoimmune problems.
Oh yeah, that there was a study by Jorge Correal published in 2007 in Argentina, just showing beautiful study, just showing he had a whole bunch of people with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, which was a death sentence at that time.
Yeah,
especially in Argentina, it could still be because they don't have access to modern therapeutics. But the bottom line was the ones that accidentally picked up an intestinal worm, their MS just absolutely stopped progressing. So that beautiful study, Jorge Correal, 2007, really nice work.
So they pick up an intestinal worm, and the MS stops getting worse, at least.
Yeah, it stops relapsing. Basically, you don't have another relapse.
Oh, okay. So they just don't have another episode.
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's amazing, and it goes back to these. It was 1972 when Peter John Preston was looking at he was in the British Army. He was a surgeon in the British Army, Royal Navy, and he's looking at a bunch of his soldiers in India, and every single one of them, he's kept getting these reports over and over again. I've got this worm. I picked up a worm. I need to get rid of it. It's cut. And they were picking up the giant round worm, which is not a worm you want to get. So it lives in your large bowel. It's about yay long, and it hurts. So they would get rid of it. But the thing was, their seasonal allergies that they had had for their whole life went away. And another guy named John Turton in 1976 gave himself a bunch of worms, probably too many worms. I mean, his seasonal allergies went away as long as he had the worms. So, really slick.
Wow. Wait, so they would go away, but they would only stay gone if the worms were inside him.
That is, yeah. If you get rid of the worms, then the allergies will come back. Yes, that is correct.
Wow. Okay, so the idea here is basically that I don't know, the immune system, it's going to have some like basal level of activity directed at something. And it's a question of what's it going to be directed at? Is it going to be directed at some worms that are in your gut, but at a tolerable level? Or if they're not there, it turns into a pollen allergy or whatever.
Yeah, so there's three basic ways that the worms work, right? And one of them is exactly what you said. It's compartment utilization. So if you're right now, you probably have pieces of your immune system which have nothing to do, absolutely nothing. You know, your mast cells, your eosinophils, your IgE producing B cells, they just don't have anything to do.
They're just sitting
because
around.
you've never been exposed to these worms, right? So that puts, but you're a male, so you have less risk than if you were a female, right? And there's just a lot of reasons for that. But anyway, the bottom line is that is one thing, compartment utilization. But the other thing is that these things create regulatory networks that sort of loop back and tune down your immune system overall. They're not immunosuppressive though, right? There's no evidence that you're more susceptible to infection. You're just more susceptible to a bad reaction causing allergy, autoimmunity, or neuropsychiatric problems. So that's two, right? It creates these regulatory networks. And then it also is compartment utilization. And the third way is one that I think, unfortunately, modern medicine is really interested in, is that the worms produce their own bioactive regulators. So we being modern medicine would like to say, ooh, we can take advantage of that and we can make a drug. But I mean, our view on that is it's not a good idea because you can't recapitulate a complex biological relationship using a single molecule. You know, it just doesn't work.
So, what do you think this means in terms of, do you have kids?
My wife and I were not that brave.
Yeah, yeah. Well, like, I don't know. How would you start to think about, like, what do you think this means in terms of how much kids should be allowed to play in the dirt and be a little dirty versus, you know, what's too clean and what's too dirty? How do you start to think about those things?
You know, while I was working at Duke, I was invited to be on the Dr. Oz show just to answer that question. You know, what should we do? And I had to turn it down because, you know, if you go out there and you get a really nice worm, say by eating a raw, say, snail, you can get something in your brain that kills you.
Right.
Right. So it's not a good idea. The guys, I'm going to just say the pioneers, and Gary Athletic is one of them, that went down to pick up worms initially. They really had to look into what they're doing, which worm they're getting, and then bring it back for therapeutic purposes. So it is not as simple as go out and eat the dirt.
Right.
And first of all, you know, the normal worms that get passed around are because somebody used the toilet outside and then I stepped in the toilet, or somebody, you know, there was another organism using the toilet, say in a farm, and then I accidentally ate some insects which had eaten that fecal material. That's a really good way to get some helminths too. And those you're not going to get by going out into, you know, it's not the same as working on a farm and having contact with farm animals where you're constantly exposed to these organisms, which even though they might not live in you very effectively because they're more adapted to a farm animal, you'll still get the exposure and they'll still modulate your immune system. So what we think, to answer your question, is that we think we've got to artificially reintroduce them.
Yeah. And some of this stuff seems to like it ties into stuff in the realm of metabolic health because, you know, when we think about obesity and metabolic syndrome and stuff like that, a lot of people have pointed out the observation that modern people tend to have a lower basal metabolic rate than traditional populations. And I know one of the big ideas for that is we just have, it's like you said, a lot of our immune system doesn't have much to do. And so it's a lot of this sort of just idle cells that would otherwise be, you know, boosting our basal metabolic rate because, you know, it takes energy to run those parts of the immune system. If we're so clean that a big chunk of our immune system is just kind of sitting around all day, then that could be a contributor to things like basal metabolic rate and metabolic issues.
Yeah. So one of the things we like to do is sort of look at the whole system. And we're not under the impression that we're only missing worms and that's our whole problem. Yeah, it's the big problem, certainly the big problem for allergy, and it appears to be the big problem for say postpartum depression, for example, just this one factor. But there's what we call the deadly five, right? We're indoors, so our vitamin D gets low. We don't have sunlight exposure. We have inflammatory diets, and we have chronically high energy diets, which is probably a big part of it. We have a sedentary lifestyle. And then we have this other factor called chronic psychological stress, because we live in an environment where we can't go out, and this goes back to our sedentary lifestyle. If we get threatened, we can't just immediately deal with it, right? Our boss comes in and might question everything that we're doing with our whole life, what we do for a living, and we just have to smile and fill out a report or something like that. We can't use a spear or something like that to do a problem, or if we do, we get in a lot of trouble. So the bottom line is that you got all of these things coming together, plus toxin exposures, which is a whole separate category. Some people are altered sleep cycle. Some people put that as a separate category, but you can lump that under, we lump it under psychological stress, but it doesn't matter. It all forms this big, nasty picture. And we, especially with autoimmune disease induction, you probably have to have depleted helminths, but it happens a lot in women. You get chronic psychological stress, and maybe combined with no helminths, and boom, you get an infection, and that triggers chronic disorder. So,
tell us a little bit about how some of this gut stuff ties into the neuropsychiatric issues that we're seeing today.
Yeah. So, I won't say we discovered. You know the story of Ignaz Semmelweis, right? He's the guy that figured out if you wash your hands, your patients won't die. So he was trying to tell everybody, and they didn't understand infectious disease.
He was that guy. And at the beginning, my understanding is that he was ridiculed initially too.
Oh, he was absolutely ridiculed. But it's a complex story. He also had a mental disorder that really affected his performance a lot. But the bottom line was he didn't actually figure that out, because they were rioting in the streets. People were rioting in the streets because they didn't want to go to this hospital. They want to go to that hospital because they knew the chances of dying were less. So this is one of the things that I get credit for publishing in the literature, is that these and we back translate in laboratory animals, these organisms helps a lot with neuropsychiatric issues. But in reality, I was studying what was going on. I had permission, and I had ethics board approval to study it was many hundreds at that time, and now it's thousands of people who are biohacking and using helminths. So I was out there investigating and finding out what people are doing, and I kept getting reports over and over again that my mental health problems dissipated when I tried to treat my allergy. I tried to treat my inflammatory bowel disease, or I tried to treat my autoimmune disease. So we collected enough data to demonstrate.
Just to be clear, when you say when they tried to treat their IBS or whatever, you mean they gave themselves worms?
Absolutely, yeah.
And just concretely, how are people doing this? Can you buy a pill of worms and swallow it? How are they giving themselves worms?
So there's two ways. It depends on which worm it is. That was my job. I studied this for over a decade. So if you want to know anything about how to treat yourself, I can't recommend anything, but I can tell you how it's done. So there's two major ways to do it. And one is with a hookworm, where you put a patch on your skin, preferably on your heel, although people used to do it on their arm, but it's not as good. And then that gives you a hookworm, which tunnels up through your skin, into your lungs, and then it gives you a lot of protection for your lungs, because they do a lot of modulation in the lungs. You cough it up, swallow it, and it grows to an adult and makes eggs.
What kind of protection?
It's a dead end cycle.
What kind of protection do they give?
They can get protection from just allergies in general. And of course, with this worm, generally the recommended, you start out very low. If you start out with 30 hookworms, you can get really sick. But they start out super low, maybe 3 or 4, which is a very low level, and gradually work their way up, usually to around 20 or something every 3 months. But you get airway hypersensitivity tends to dissipate. We published a really good.
People will take hookworms and they'll just keep titrating up the number until their symptoms go away.
Yeah.
Wow. And do they just live in you forever?
Oh, no, not a hookworm. There's one worm that'll live in you forever, but nobody uses that because it produces little wiggly egg sacs that come out your anus at times you can't predict. So that's not really good. But other than that, it doesn't have any side effects.
Wow.
Anyway, people don't use that one, but you probably need to replenish the hookworm might live in you for a year, but after apparently, and this is based on thousands of people literally doing this over time, trial and error. Apparently, after a few months, maybe 6 months, they just don't work very well for immune modulation for some reason. So you just need some fresh ones.
Wow. So again, the idea is that when you see an effect here, it depends on having the worm inside you. It's not a permanent thing.
It is not so. It is not a permanent thing, and so for studies. So there's different ways to look at this. Studies of people who immigrate to high-income parts of the world, so they immigrate from a helminth-rich region to a helminth-depleted region, they'll start seeing certain effects within about 5 years, if they start becoming sensitive to allergies. So if you grew up and your system is adjusted to it, you can have protection for a while, but it's not going to be permanent.
Oh, I see. So it's not entirely based on like what happened in your childhood. Someone can move to another part of the world in adulthood, and within a few years, I mean, the idea would be that you might have some worms inside of you. After a few years, they're no longer inside of you, and then you start developing allergies or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. Then you get susceptible to all the Western diseases.
Wow.
That's pretty much what it boils down to. Yeah.
And so hookworms, did you say there was another one that people commonly took?
Oh yeah, yeah. So the hookworm, the other two are a whipworm, the porcine whipworm is called TSO, and then there's the rat tapeworm, which it's called the HDC. Stands for and TSO and HDC are genus, species, and then the life stage of the organism that they're using. So they're using other worms, and generally the most benign worm is the most expensive and hardest to get, whereas the hookworm is the easiest to get. So it's it's basically a trade-off between how much time and money and effort you have versus what you want to get. So you can get a hookworm really cheap, but if you want an HTC, you really almost need to know somebody who's spending a lot of time, effort, and energy to make it.
Wow. And so remind us, so what are all of the most common conditions that people out there are saying are treated by these worms?
Yeah, so it doesn't work. They don't work, it seems, very well at all for persistent or progressive autoimmune conditions. But they work for relapsing, remitting autoimmune conditions.
Things that come and go.
Yeah, things that come and go. Lupus would be a classic example. MS would be a classic example. Chronic fatigue would be a classic example of that. Although that's leaning more toward the neuropsychiatric, right? And then of course depression, anxiety disorders, postpartum depression, and then you've got the allergic stuff. So the thing that we see with the allergic stuff is the helminths don't. Once your immune system has decided, for example, that peanuts are bad, that's probably never going to change. The helminths don't go back and rewrite your immune system, but they'll tune it down so that your reactivity to the peanuts in this case will be a lot less, and you don't have to worry about, for example, an anaphylaxis. At least that's the information that we were able to glean from looking at over 1,000 reports that we viewed systematically. We can rule out survivor bias. We can rule out some other kinds of bias that would plague, say, just collecting a bunch of anecdotes. But
so, wow. So would there actually be some risk in taking anti-parasitic medications unless you really needed to? Like if you just wanted to, as a precautionary thing, I've heard of people doing this. They take some anti-parasitic medication because there might be some worms or some whatever inside of them. There could actually be some risk in doing that if what you're saying is true.
Well, I mean, if they're assuming they're a Westerner, if there's somebody that can just go get their doctor to give them a prescription for an anti-parasitic, they probably don't have any parasites anyway.
Right.
Then
Yeah. Wow. But basically, if you were living in a helminth-rich place or a place rich in whatever possible parasite we want to talk about, and then you move somewhere that is devoid of those things. You're saying it's common for people to develop allergies or other things a few years after making a move like that.
Yeah, there was a pretty big study done on people migrating from parts of Africa to Israel. Really nicely done, and if you read the report, it's almost humorous. They're studying, they're doing blood workups on these people coming out of Africa, and they're saying, well, they have eosinophilia, for example, which are they're measuring IgE levels and saying, wow, they must have raging allergies. It's like, no, those components in their immune system are actually doing what they were meant to do.
Right.
So if they were a Westerner with that blood panel, they would be sick. But these people are not sick. Right? Their immune system is doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Right. It's like, where's that immune energy, so to speak, being directed? It's actually it's being channeled into something rather than going berserk.
Yeah, very well said. Yeah.
Wow. So what sorts of things are you working on today?
Well, so the big deal in the field, right, is to try to get these things so that you can go to the drugstore and buy them. The big problem in the field is that getting something through the drug pipeline can cost hundreds of millions of dollars. That's not an exaggeration, hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you can't patent the drug, and it's classified as a drug, imagine if we had this problem with vitamin C, right? We just figured out, oh my gosh, we can cure this horrible thing, scurvy, by putting in this vitamin C, but you can't patent vitamin C, and you need hundreds of millions of dollars to run the clinical trial. So what are you going to do about it? So this is sort of where we're at with the worms. Some trials have been run, but they're run. They'll give somebody 10 worms one time, or there's a lot of issues with how these trials are run. You could think of it as exercise for the immune system, and you've already obviously grasped that. So if you want to give somebody an exercise regimen, you need an extended trial with a gradual workup.
Right.
So that's an expensive trial, and what we're hoping for is that we can get an NGO or a government to run it. Some of the trials have been run, but it's not even real science, because you're getting a worm from a company, but you don't know how they produced it.
I see.
Right? And from what we can tell, they keep changing the formula of how they make it, and it's a living organism. So if you run the trial with a worm that you don't know how they produced, then it's not it's never going to be reproduced. Right. It's a problem.
Okay, so you're saying there's a lot of people in the biohacker community and places like that have gone renegade. They've done their own experiments, and you've seen a lot of examples of those. You think it is a viable treatment to actually give people the right dose of the right worm to treat certain things, but for the reasons you just mentioned, it's really hard to get the resources you need to do a properly done long-term trial to really nail down what's going on.
Well, I say it's really hard. I'll just say we haven't managed it yet. If the right person in the right place, the right time finds that, wow, this saved my life, many people have, but if the right person, the right place, the right time, they could fund the trial, and we'd be off to the races.
Getting the funding is the tough part, not necessarily the design, if you already know what you're doing.
Yeah, we already know what we're doing, and unfortunately, if you look into the history of a lot of these smaller trials that people have tried, that they're treating it like a drug, not like exercise for the immune system. So and we've published papers on this. They're all in the peer-reviewed literature. This is what we do. But we would like to not be working in academics. We would like to be working in actually getting the stuff out there, because we've known really how to do this since 1968. I asked Brian. I said, Brian, he's Sir Dr. Greenwood, right? His whole career, he's retired now. Ask him, why, you had it figured out in 1970. Why didn't you guys go for it and fix people? And he's like, well, that's not what immunologists do. All right. And it's sort of true. You really need a worm farmer.
So what do you think the next steps are for this whole area?
Well, I think so there's two possible routes where we could get it to work. And one is if Congress changes it to make it not a drug. So it's something that our body needs, but they even made fecal material a drug, right? So, but there's a lot of changes right now at the national level on those on the personnel that are involved in those regulations. So they might change. So if we can make it as what it really should be, which is just part of our biome, and it should be unrestricted. If people are going to take it in their body, it needs to have FDA, but it needs to have D, not the D. It needs to have the food part, not the D part. Right. right? And then it's not $200 million to get it done. It's, I produced it, it's safe, it's not hurting anybody. That's kind of how they do it in the UK. It's how they do it in Thailand. But they're not allowed to advertise what it can actually do. So
Wow.
that's one possibility, change in regulations. The other is to actually get the money, run the trial, and then I think making it open source is the way to go. You don't want it to be where it's going to cost somebody $500,000 per year per person to get it, and your insurance has to pay for it. That is not the right thing to do. It really should be, I think, government supported and open source.
Hmm. Wow. So when people are taking these like worm patches and letting a worm go burrow through their skin and go to their lungs, I mean, is the worm so small that you don't even feel it? Like, do you notice it?
Well, so the ones that you take orally, there you can't technically you can see them, but they're so small if you put them in almond milk or whatever, you can't see them. The ones that when you put them on your skin, those when they burrow in the skin, you can definitely sense those going in your skin, which makes it a little tough to run the placebo, but they try with chili pepper or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that reaction is highly variable from individual to individual. So some people it's a pretty severe, and that the physicians have learned that they can attenuate that using certain topical ointments or basically you suppress the immune system and you can make those kind of reactions go away.
Mm-hmm. But the bottom line is, whether it's worms or protozoans or bacteria, there's good, bad, and ugly. And a lot of what we've done in modern times is just sort of indiscriminately get rid of all of the above. That has the benefit of getting us away from a lot of the infectious diseases that used to cause us problems. But it's come with this side effect, if you will, that our immune systems aren't being exposed to a rich biome of creatures inside of us like they used to be, and that is leading to more autoimmunity, and it's just not training up the immune system in the way it was meant to be trained.
Yeah, and the autoimmunity is actually the third leading problem, right? The first leading problem is probably allergy. Second is probably major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders, and then you've got the autoimmune after that. So yeah, it's extremely problematic from an immune system perspective, and then it interacts with these other factors, low vitamin D, the sedentary lifestyle, the chronic psychological stress, and it's sort of you could think of as having a lot of holes in your boat, but one of the bigger holes in the boat is this missing helmet. So that's a good one to plug. But when we run our clinical trials, we will be smart about it. We're not going to get somebody who's got all kinds of other problems, low vitamin D, your gut has a hard time functioning with very, very low vitamin D level. Your gut immune system does.
Mm-hmm.
And chronic psychological stress, it doesn't make any sense to try to help somebody with depression when they've got these other issues going on. So you fix the ones you can easily fix, you fix the helminths, and then you see what kind of effect you can get. And based on what we know from biohackers, from objective, academic, controlled studies of people biohacking, it looks like it's going to work extremely well.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about this paper that you sent me about COVID-19 morbidity in lower versus higher income populations. How does stuff like that tie into some of the things that you've been talking about and the idea of biome reconstitution?
Right. So what you're talking about is a paper that we and others published papers that said, and there were 7 groups around the world that basically said, look, based on how immune systems work and based on what we see going on with COVID in Western world, we don't think that clinically COVID is going to have a huge impact in the low-income countries. We don't think it's going to happen. And the vast majority of all other scientists, especially the epidemiologists, are saying it's going to be catastrophic. It's going to destroy whole countries.
I remember this, yeah.
Yeah, because they don't
out
have the resources. They can't buy a mask. They can't socially distance. They can't stop working for a day or they starve. So it's like this is going to be catastrophic. And everybody is saying this. And there's and everybody that I knew in the health self-treatment community is saying, William, you need to write the paper. Hurry up, get off your ass and write this paper. And just because it's not going to happen, right? And the reason why is, and I mentioned it earlier, right? You've got a classic case of somebody who's missing their helminths, and they're super stressed because they're living in a modern society,
Right.
and they
And
get
now
an
they're in
infection.
lockdown and all that stuff. It's even more
Yep.
stress.
Boom, and it
Yeah.
triggers something really bad,
Yeah.
and it
Okay.
can trigger.
I see exactly where this is going, but just as a reminder for those listening, right? Early COVID, we didn't know what was going on. The idea here to put this together for people is us, like you and me, the people living in so-called Western society, we've essentially got hyperactive immune systems for all the reasons that William already discussed with us. Our, our immune system is not being trained and it's not being directed at helminths and other things that are normally in the guts of, or used to be in the guts of humans, but in other parts of the world that are lower income, they don't have this problem because they have a higher parasite load and they have a richer biome. So their immune systems are not going to be hyperreactive. And the whole problem with COVID, or a big problem with COVID in the beginning, was people were basically dying from an overreaction from the immune system.
Yeah, and as soon as that data came in, as soon as the data came in, which came in pretty quickly, it came in early 2020, saying that this looks like the people that are dying are having an autoimmune-like reaction. Immediately, we knew not going to be a problem in developing countries. Mm-hmm. So that was just a matter of getting that word out. We were very unsuccessful. We published our little papers, but nobody listened. And then it turned out, that they had built whole clinics, in Africa that just remained vacant. Nobody ever showed up because they didn't need them. It was in Madagascar, they can consider it a rich white man disease.
Yeah.
So it literally a huge difference in the impact, and myself and one of the members of my team got calls from the government's COVID committee and say, hey, can you give us a pill that'll fix this? We're like, no, it's exercise for the immune system. It's got to be consistent over time, and we know how to do it, but that's not what they wanted. They needed a pill that would fix it, which we couldn't give them. So it's sort of like going on the Dr. Oz show. No, I can't tell you what to do about it right now because nothing's been approved. So that was the whole problem, is that we know how to fix this, but it's not a simple fix.
Right. Exercise for the immune system. And it's a little bit of exercise kind of all the time. This just used to be how people lived. You always had all of these creatures in your gut. You're always exposed to them at this baseline level, and your immune system, was working out every week, so to speak. It wasn't just exposed to one big infection like out of nowhere. It was just a very different pattern of immune system environment interaction.
Yeah, and it's important to just state the obvious. Like, some of these organisms are really bad.
Right.
You can get appendicitis, you can get parasites in your eye, in your brain. You can get all kinds of bad things that come from these cestodes and nematodes that are around. But there's a lot of them, again, that you never heard of. So it's sort of, we don't want the salmonella, but we would love to have the bifidobacteria that are just around everywhere.
Yeah, it's a trade-off. But yeah, I do remember the early days of the pandemic, and people were really scratching their heads like, why isn't this blowing up in Africa in the same way?
Right. Yeah, and everybody was worried about it. Not everybody, but most people worry about it. My group was the first one to say, nope, not going to happen. And at that time, it was risky to say it, but based on what we knew about what was going on in the U.S. and all the autoimmune reactions, we were confident that was not going to happen in Africa. So we were able to make the call on that one, which is what good science should do. It should allow you to predict things, and it does.
Yeah. Well, it also just goes to show it's important to think about context and to not have this narrow view of, immunologists that live in the Western world, in this highly hygienic place where we have guts that have, gone in this direction. Like, that's not every context that people used to live in, or that even people today live in different parts of the world. And it's easy to have those blinders on and to generalize from our context that we live in right here.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm most renowned for, and one of the things I did at Duke, was I was the first one to go catch a bunch of wild rats and compare their immune systems to lab rats. It's a great way. Our lab rats are super clean, screened for everything. They don't have anything. The wild rats have, they've got so much stuff that our lab rats don't have. It's a really nice comparison between modern humans, our lab rats, and our ancestors or hunter-gatherers, which are the wild rats. So the first time I sent a sample, so we routinely send our lab rat samples off to the lab to screen for everything. Right. Well, I sent some wild rat samples off, and I didn't tell them it was a wild rat. And normally they just send you a report back, they don't have anything. But no, I got a phone call. They're like Dr. Parker, your rats. I mean, something is horribly wrong with your rats because they have everything, and they just started like, it's okay, they're wild rats. So it was a funny, but the point is that we looked at their immune system. We looked at 170 some odd different parameters, and more than 80 of those were different by at least 2 standard deviations from the mean. Right, so you're looking at huge changes all over. And like I said, there's compartment utilization. They produce their own regulatory molecules, and they produce feedback loops. So you've got all these 3 different things going on, which makes huge differences. And a lot of the drugs that we use today in immunosuppressing patients sort of mimic a little bit, but in a very, very crude, brutal way. They mimic a little bit in what the helminths do with immune regulation.
What are some final thoughts that you want to leave people with, or things you'd like them to think about when it comes to this broad topic of just hygiene and cleanliness on the one hand, and immune system function and diseases of modernity on the other?
Let's see. Well, a few final thoughts would be: we've got a ways to go. We need to deal with the underlying cause. Right. So first of all, if you need to get your appendix taken out, get it taken out. Right. Don't sacrifice your life to save your appendix. That's not a good idea. And then second, if you know somebody with a few $100 million to invest in a nonprofit enterprise, there's some people that really know how to deal with these problems. So that's really I think the next step, the future of it, is to try to figure out how to deal with economic realities and get solutions to the people that desperately need them.
All right. Well, William Parker, thank you very much for your time. This is a fascinating area that I really didn't know much about. But yeah, I mean, some of this, wow, I didn't know people were giving themselves worms on purpose.
Oh yeah, it's thousands of people now. It was quite a few people back when I was studying it, and it's many, many more right now. And the social networking. So there's, people initially had to do a lot of experimentation, but the social networking now is really very good. So the protocols have all been worked out. It's just this sort of under the table biohacking community. Yeah, very interesting.
All right, Dr. William Parker, thank you for your time.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. Hey everyone, I want to take just a minute to tell you about a really cool health monitoring device I've been using called Lumen. It's a handheld, pocket-sized device with a sleek design. The Lumen device measures CO2 levels in your breath, which allows their technology to determine the extent to which your body is burning fats versus carbohydrates. Lumen helps improve your metabolic flexibility, your body's efficiency in shifting between using fats and carbs for energy. I use this device in the morning or before bed or after meals or after workouts to track my metabolism. With just a couple weeks of use, I learned a lot about which foods were causing my body to burn mostly fat, mostly carbs, or both, as well as how long I needed to fast and how hard I needed to exercise to promote fat burning. Being able to track whether your body is burning fat versus carbs will help you figure out how your body responds to your lifestyle and whether or not your weight loss and fitness strategies are actually working. Lumen is great for anyone looking to optimize their health for either weight loss or athletic performance. Their easy-to-use app allows you to track your results together with what you're eating and how you're exercising, and it syncs with other devices like the Apple Watch. Click the link in the episode description to learn more and use the code MINDMATTER, MINDMATTER, to get 10% off your Lumen device today. That's on top of the site-wide sale they are currently running, and the Lumen device is eligible to be paid for with FSA and HSA health accounts. Check out the link in the episode description for more info.